Hey everyone, Lisel Crowley here at the Cool Tool Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful tide pool pendant using FS999 clay, some resin, and some wonderful new textures. Let's get started. So these are the tools we're going to need to complete this project. First of all, you're going to want some FS999 Fine Silver Clay. It's a wonderful clay for this project. It's creamy and flexible and just takes texture beautifully. I like to keep my clay in a hydrator when I'm working. It keeps it soft and moist without drying out. You want a clay roller, thickness frames, a work surface. I prefer the clay board. I love the fact that it's on 4 no slip feet, so whatever surface I'm working on, I have a nice stable level surface. A circle template, a mold for making a domed piece, and I like these little paint palettes that Cool Tool sells. They're the perfect size and really manageable. You can even put them in the dehydrator to dry if you need to. Textures of choice, I've selected this texture that has seashells and such on them, and this lovely new easy release texture for the back, but you could really mix and match the textures however you would like. Because it's a tide pool, I am using a sea-themed texture, and I'm also using these acrylic rollers that have seashells and shells and stars on them. And you'll see how I use those when we get into the project. We're also going to need water and brush, lubricant, coil roller, cutter scraper, clay pick. And once the piece is fired, we're going to use resin to create the tide pool effect. So we're going to use ice resin and alcohol inks to tint. The toothpicks are to mix the resin. Also a tough card to work on, and that's it. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is make the back piece for the pendant. And for this particular one, I'm going to texture on both sides. So I've selected this lovely easy release texture. It's one of the new textures that Cool Tools has recently come out with for the back. And this texture that has, it's called seashells, and that's what it has. It has seashells and starfish on it. So this will be the front of the piece. So the first thing we want to do is lubricate both textures. Now the easy release texture does not need a lot of lube, so I usually spray from quite a distance and just rub that in. And these darker ones do need a little bit more, so I spray a little closer and rub that in. But then I like to dab it with paper towel so that there's not too much lube. If you get too much lube in your clay, it can contaminate the clay a bit. So now that these are lubricated, I'll set them aside, and I'm going to take my FS999 clay and roll it out 4 cards thick. I've got lube on my hands from the texture, so I'm just rubbing that on my big roller. And I'm going to roll. And I always like to roll gently and rotate the clay. That gives me a nice round sheet of clay. And once it is no longer expanding, I know I've achieved my 4 cards thickness, so I'm going to set that aside. And I'm going to texture 2 sides at once. So I'm going to put my larger texture face up, lay my clay over it. I'm going to take my 2 card frame and put that over the clay. And then I'm going to take the seashell textures and put it over the top. And I'm going to roll with one firm, even swipe. And I'm pressing fairly hard because I want to get a texture on both sides. So here's the one side, and here is that lovely texture on the other side. The next step is to cut out a circle, and because this particular texture has a very clear circular shape, I'm actually going to use that as the basis for my cutout. And I want to go fairly large for this because when I make my tide pool on the other side, I want it to be big enough so you can really see it. So I'm just going to anchor my clay in my template and cut around. Take away the excess. And now I'll take another tough card and flip it. So there's my background. So now I'm going to cut the frame for the top of the piece, and I'm going to use this texture yet again. So I'm going to again roll the clay out 4 cards thick. I may or may not have enough clay here. I'm going to just fold this over on itself to make it a little more round. Sometimes it looks like I don't have enough clay, and then when I go to texture, I have plenty. I am going to re-lubricate this texture. Place my clay on the texture, my frame on the texture, and roll again with a very firm, even pass. Isn't that a sweet little texture? And now I'm going to cut a slightly larger circle. So this was the circle I cut for the back. I'm going to cut this for the top. When you cut with a template, always make sure you don't press too hard with your needle tool. If you press too hard, you run the risk of scratching your work surface, but also the needle tool can vibrate, and that can create a jagged cut. Now, I'm going to need to cut a hole out from the middle of this because I'm making a frame. So I need... because I'm going to be setting the template on top of this, I don't want to squash my texture. So I'm using these frames to make sure that the template just sits on top. And I want my circle to be big enough so that you can see the tide pool, but not so big that you don't have much of a frame. So I'm going to go with this size here. And I'm centering by eye. And I find with these, if it's slightly off center, I don't have an issue with that. I'm not a perfectionist. And I'm going to cut this out. Now I'm going to take this paint palette, and I want to lightly lube this as well. Always wipe off the excess. This part's just a tad tricky. I'm going to pick up this donut that I've just made and get it onto the paint palette. And this is to give it a domed shape. And I find because I've lubricated this palette nicely, I can adjust to bring the circle back because it does lose its circular shape when you go to pick it up. Okay, I'm getting the circle as best as I can. And now these two items will be set aside to dry. And when they're dried, I'll sand them and put them together, and then I'll create a little tide pool inside. Okay, so these are our two pieces that have been dried. And the first thing I'm going to do is sand the edge of this so it has somewhat of a flat surface. So let me get this palette out of the way. And I'm going to use a sanding pad. And I'm just going to gently rotate this on the sanding pad. It's kind of the same way you would sand for a lentil. You want to create a flat surface so that you get a good bond. And you can see I've created a nice flat edge there. Now I'm going to very generously wet this edge with water. Now I have used the same texture for the frame and the back of the piece, but you could easily mix and match. They don't have to be the same. I just want to get this positioned. This part's just a little tricky. You want to get it centered on there as well as you can. And I like to pick it up and look at it from the side to make sure it's centered. Sometimes it's hard to tell from the top. And then I also like to wet it. If you see on the back, that top piece basically surrounds the base piece. So I'm just going to wet very thoroughly around this edge. So when you're joining these two pieces together, you want to make sure there's no gaps that the resin will run through once you add the resin. So be careful of that as you form the piece. The next thing I'm going to do is create some elements to go inside there for my tide pool look. And I like to do that once I've already applied the frame, because that way I can see exactly where things are going to be oriented. So to do that, I'm using these wonderful acrylic rollers. If you haven't used these, I urge you to try them. They make such beautiful, deep impressions. So I'm going to roll my FS999 clay out 4 cards thick. Now, one thing about these rollers are they are kind of small, so I can't really use the frame the way it's designed to be used. So when I want to go down to 2 cards thick, instead of using 1 frame, I'm using 2. And that allows me to get the frame in close enough that I can use it while I roll the clay. Another thing is I do want to lightly lube these. They don't need a lot of lube, but it's better to have some lube on there. Instead of spraying it, I'm going to just rub some lubricant on with my fingers. Now, one thing I've noticed with these, if I start from the edge, the clay will kind of roll up with the roller. But if I start slightly in from the edge, it doesn't do that. So I'm sliding slightly in from the edge, and I'm just very carefully rolling. And look at how crisp and sharp that cut is. Now I'm going to select some items and just cut them out with my clay pick. I like to work in odd numbers, so I'll probably do 3. Now, this edge is going to be kind of rough. I am going to place them in here to see where I want to put them, but I'm not going to adhere them. I'm going to dry them and sand them first, and then I'll adhere them. But I do want to place them to make sure I have a design that I like. And I like this shell right here. I'm also going to cut out this scallop shell just in case I like it better than one of the others. And you don't, I mean, you can put any number of elements in that you want without making it look crowded. I just happen to like odd numbers. Okay. I just want to show you this other texture. This one is called Starry Night, I believe, or Starry Sky. I might actually opt to use one of the stars from this texture. So I'm just going to also roll this one out. Let me just scoop these out of the way. You could do this with a floral theme. You could do it with any of the antique molds that Cool Tool sells to create something on the inside. I've used the dragon mold several times. I love that one. You could really have fun with making these shadow box style pieces. You're creating like a little world inside that frame. So I'm going to roll out some of these stars. There's also moons on this one, but I'm only interested in the stars. Let me just see how this looks. This looks more like a star from the sky, so I may not use it, but I will audition it and see how I like it. Once, you know, you can audition these things and see how you like them before you adhere them, and you can really be flexible with your design and change it up. The other thing about this is it's okay if these start to dry out, because it actually is going to make it easier for you to move them around and test them. I actually like both stars, and I might use them both and have them sort of overlapping each other with a shell on the side. And I can gently nudge and move them. Nudge is a technical term to get them where I want them. And so you've got multiple layers of texture here, because I've got the texture in the background and then the items that are sitting on top. If you prefer, you can have a smooth background or a much finer texture on the background. That is something you can also play with. Let me just see if I want to get a few more elements in here. I don't want to make it too busy, but it's also a large enough. I actually like that. So this is what I'm going to go with. Again, I'm not going to bond them now because I need to sand them first. So I need to put this back in the dehydrator and let it dry. I'll sand each of these elements. I'll attach them with water. And then finally, I'll make a frame to go around the entire piece. Okay, so here are my little elements. I've pre-sanded these. I'm just going to sand this one to show you how I go about doing it. And these are pretty delicate, so you want to treat them delicately. But you also, again, I'm not quite a perfectionist, so all I'm doing is cleaning up the edge. And if you are nervous about sanding them, sometimes you can also just clean up the edge with a wet brush. And that will be enough. If there's a lot of clay around that edge and you want to clean it away, you can cut it away with a scalpel. But you just want to clean up those edges. And now I'm going to start placing them. And this is one of the reasons I really like these water troughs. I used to use just a cup for water, and once I discovered these, I just love them. One reason I love them for is that the brush, it gives you a natural brush rest. But the other reason I love them for is when I want to do something like this, I can just dip my entire piece in the water and place it. And remember, I want to have a little bit of overlap. Okay, now once I have them placed, now I don't really want this sticking up above the frame. So I don't know if you can see this, but this little starfish is sticking up above the frame. And I really don't want that, because when I go to fill it in with resin, I want everything under the resin. So what I'm going to do is lube my finger with a little cool slip and just press. And because these pieces are wet, they will bend slightly. And now it's under the surface of the frame, and they're also kind of melding together nicely. So this will need to dry again. And then I'm going to sand the edge and put a frame around it with a loop for a bail, and then it'll be ready to fire. So here's the piece. Those elements on the inside have been dried. Now I want to sand around the edge and put a frame. So what I want to do is sort of round and smooth this edge. And because it's a circle, you don't want to sand too much in one place, because otherwise you can turn your circle into an amoeba. And notice how I rotate my sanding pad as I sand. And this is a fine grit. You don't need a super coarse grit. You're not removing a lot of material, you're just kind of smoothing. And where there's a bit of an overlap, I'm going to just kind of sand that edge down. And I just want it to look nice and uniform and smooth all the way around. So I also want to just sand over the edge of that top frame. Just make it smooth and not look cut. Really doesn't need much. And I'll also do just a light, I'll just run my sanding pad lightly over those elements on the inside. I like to use one of these wonderful wide brushes to brush away all the sanding dust. And of course you want to reclaim your sanding dust. I reclaim it in a tray. You can reclaim it in your paste jar, but you certainly don't want to throw it out. Okay, so the next step is to create a frame, and the frame will also provide the hanging loop for the bail that I'm going to add after it's fired. I want to figure out my orientation, so I'll look at it from different angles and see which I want to be the top, and I think I'm going to have this be the top right here. So now I'm going to create a coil. So to basic coil rolling technique, the first thing is to start with fresh clay or freshly reconstituted clay. The other thing is not to use more clay than you need, and also handle it as little as possible with your fingers, because the more you handle it with your hands, the more moisture you're going to lose. You do have to sort of get it round before you start rolling it. The other thing is to not lubricate any surface. Your work surface should not be lubricated, and your coil roller should not be lubricated. You don't want it sliding around. You want a little bit of traction. You also want to work fairly quickly. The quicker you can roll your coil, the less likely it is to be dried out. I also like to make sure I taper my ends on my coil. That's just a personal preference. It's not a requirement. See how it flattened out here? I have enough clay that I can just pinch that off. And the key is not to have a coil that has a lot of surface cracks in it. You want it nice and smooth. Once you get it completely rolled, you want to take your brush and brush it with water, top and bottom. You want it to slide around. If I were to just wet the top and not the bottom, not underneath, it wouldn't slide around, it would grab. So now that I have my coil rolled and wet, I'm going to bring my piece back, and notice I'm handling the coil more with my brush than I am with my fingers. And I'm going to just, because I want to use that tapered end, I'm going to have that on the top. And I'm just going to lay my coil down around the piece to create the frame. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is bring my clay pick in, and you can keep wetting. You can't ever make the coil too wet at this stage. So what I'm doing here is smoothing my frame against the piece and providing a little bit of what I would call pressure to get it to bond. And I'm going to come in with my clay pick and I'm going to trim this off at an angle. Okay? And now that that's trimmed off, I can come back in with this and make my hanging loop. Now, I'm just making a loop, and I'm going to add a bail after it's fired. So I like to just keep brushing around the surface. That helps to, around the edge. That just helps to make sure I've got good connection from the frame to the piece. And again, I can use plenty of water because this piece is dry, so getting it wet is not going to compromise the texture in any way. Now there is a little gap here where my frame connects, and I'm going to fix that very easily by making a little ball of clay. And again, with little balls of clay, you really don't need a lot of clay. I very often pinch off way more than I need. I'm going to place that right there and just compress it and then wet. Okay, so this will be dried. I'll do a final sanding and then it'll be fired and we'll bring it to a satin finish and then we'll fill it with resin. Okay, so this is our Tide Pool and it's been fired and brushed. But you can see that there's a lot of different areas here that the brush didn't reach. This is the brush I use for overall brushing, but this little scratch brush that Cool Tools sells is fantastic for getting into these deep nooks and crannies. And you really want to burnish that area inside because when you put the resin on, you want it to be shiny under the resin and that way it will show up better. So you just want to get in there into the nooks and the crannies with this little scratch brush. Then we're going to patina the frame and the back, and then we're going to add the resin. Okay, so now we have this Tide Pool pendant. What we've done is we fired it, we've polished it, and we've patinaed the frame and the back. And now I'm going to add resin to the center part. First of all, we're going to mix our resin. We're using ice resin, which is a 2-part epoxy resin, and this needs a 24-hour cure time. You could also use a UV resin if you prefer. So I'm going to take the lid off, and one of the things I like about this ice resin is that you need equal parts of hardener and resin, and the way that it is in this syringe, you just automatically get those equal parts. And I'm just going to squeeze out enough to fill our pendant. I don't really want to waste any of that resin, and always make sure you put your lid back on. Now we have to stir this, and you need to stir for a couple of minutes. You want to make sure that the hardener and the resin are thoroughly incorporated, and you'll find that the hardener is a little bit yellower than the resin, so as you stir it'll turn from yellow to clear. You also might see some bubbles form as you stir. There is a way to get rid of those bubbles once you fill the pendant, so don't be concerned about those. So I'm going to stir for a couple of minutes. And what I'm using to stir is this wonderful enameling spoon. This is great for stirring the resin, and it's also great for filling the pendant. I'm also going to do some stirring once I add the color. So I'm going to add the color now. And what I'm going to do is tint the resin with alcohol inks. And the alcohol inks come in several shades of blue. The one I'm going to use today is called Aqua, or Aqua. I am not going to put the ink directly into the resin. I'm actually going to put it in a side little depression in the palette, and I'm going to take a toothpick and pick up this ink with the toothpick and start adding it. Actually, I'm going to use the spoon to pick up some inks because this ink is a lighter ink, and get that into the resin. And you want to work slowly when you're coloring the resin because it's very easy to over tint. Let me get this toothpick out of the way. It's very easy to over tint and to make it too dark. So it's better to just add a little bit at a time. I want the color to show up nicely, but I don't want it to be so dark that it's going to obscure the design. And this is a little on the green side for me. So I'm going to come in with another blue called Cloudy Blue. And that's just a little darker and a little bluer. And this is another thing that's great about working with resin and alcohol inks, is that you can custom color. You can mix the inks to make a custom blend. I'm just going to add a little more of that cloudy blue. And this is going to look like a sea green blue color. That's going to look very pretty. Now, it would be faster to do a drop of alcohol ink right into the resin, but you do run the risk of it being too dark, and we don't want that. So that's like a sea blue-green. I think that'll be very pretty. So now I want to put my pendant on a tough card, just so that when it's done I can move it easily. And you want to keep it level as you're working. And you just want to start scooping this resin in here. And you see, as the resin fills that space in the pendant, it sort of magnifies the items that are underneath. And it gives it that nice sea green color. I'm dripping a little on the side here. I can easily wipe that away with paper towel once I get the piece filled. Now this is a self-doming resin, so I want to fill it to the point where it's just doming. I don't want it overflowing over the frame. And you want to also kind of push it so that it gets under that frame. And that's probably just enough. This resin does not shrink as it dries, so what you see is what you're going to get. I think that is just the perfect amount. So what I'm going to do is just carefully wipe away anything that's spilled over the side. I got a little on my finger, but I can just wipe that off. If after it's dry, I notice that maybe I missed a piece of resin that fell on the side of the frame, I can easily remove that with nail polish remover. But this is basically how the pendant is going to look. It's going to be set aside to dry for 24 hours. The air bubbles, there aren't any air bubbles, but if you did have a lot of air bubbles, all you would have to do is run a torch very lightly over the surface, or a heat gun very lightly over the surface, not to burn it, but just to heat it up, and that heat will cause those bubbles to pop immediately. But there we have our Tide Pool pendant ready to set aside and dry. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you will try making these shadow box pendants yourself. So here's the finished piece. I love those acrylic rollers for making the shapes that you can cut out and form inside. You can also hand sculpt little flowers, or you can use other textures and cut out little parts of those textures to create your scene inside the shadow box. I hope you have fun with this project and also play with tinting the resin in different colors and see what you like. I hope you have fun making these.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.